Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, September 1st, 2025. Happy September. Today we are going to be taking a look at the 2026 Senate elections. My prediction that we do every single month at the beginning of the month, looking at the state of the race ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. We've had some recent announcements and speculations across a number of different states ahead of the 2026 midterms. Since my last prediction, Sherrod Brown has entered into the race in the state of Ohio. A lot of speculation has been fueled towards Congresswoman Mary Peltola running in the state of Alaska. So there are certainly a lot of considerations to be had about the Senate races and a lot that's up for discussion as we look to head to the next year and a quarter as we get into the final stretch of the 2025 season and right into the 2026 season that already seems to have begun. Now, Democrats start off with 34 seats that are not up for re-election. Republicans are at 31. But having this slight Democratic advantage should not, misguide you as to how the direction of these Senate races go. Republicans do ultimately have a lot of territory they are defending in theory that are otherwise going to be quite safe and quite solid for the incumbent party here. And not much is going to change that between now and November of 2026. As we typically do at the beginning of these videos, we start off by characterizing all of the states that we believe to be safe for the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. To begin, we'll start with the GOP, who jumps really high up in terms of safe states going into what we expect to see in the 2026 midterm cycle. And unlike what we've seen in years past, a lot of these states that might have been competitive in 2018 or in 2020 are not going to be competitive in 2026. A lot of these states that Democrats might have invested in the previous cycle where this class of Senate seats were up, like in 2020 when Democrats spent tens of millions of dollars in states like Kansas and Mississippi and South Carolina and Montana and Kentucky. None of these states in this cycle are expected to be competitive. Republicans jump up immediately at 45 solid states that we can consider to be safe. Now, for the Democratic Party, they have quite a few states as well that we can consider to be safe. Delaware is considered to be a safe state. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Oregon, Illinois. These are all states that I would say pretty much at baseline here are going to be pretty locked in for the Democratic Party. I'd also say that given the candidates that we expect out of Minnesota and out of Colorado, what we're seeing thus far is that looking at the race right now in the Senate race in Colorado, going to be an easy victory for the Democrats. In Minnesota, Colorado, keep in mind too, Harris won by 11 points. It's actually not that surprising to see how 2 years later on a much more Democratic year, Colorado becomes safe. Minnesota, Royce White, who is probably one of the worst candidates Republicans have run in recent memory in the state of Minnesota, is expected to be the 2026 GOP nominee as well. Pretty much a sacrificial lamb, if you ask me what you're expecting out of the seat. Very, very bad candidate, arguably. This race, especially given the national environment, will also likely vote safe for the Democratic Party. But that's pretty much it. Brings the Democrats to about 41 across the country, Republicans at 45. Now, this is where we get into some of the states that we determine to be likely. A lot of these states that are safe, no matter what happens on the national level, they simply will not budge. Even if, hell freezes over, these states are likely to go towards their respective political parties because that's how entrenched in the support is. And again, given some of these candidates, the only notable exception here, I think maybe Minnesota, that actually could see a slight narrowing down, and that's a huge if in this state. Other than that, the remainder of these races are actually the ones that are going to receive a lot of national attention, a lot of funding and focus and energy and resources from both political parties. But some of these states tend to be a little bit more solid for the Republican and Democratic parties, but they aren't going to be considered safe, meaning that in the most extreme scenarios, we could see a possibility in which a Democrat or a Republican could defeat someone in a race like this. So we'll take a look. The first state that I'd characterize as likely for the Republican Party is the state of Florida. Now, that really shouldn't surprise you. It's a state that Rick Scott right now, he just won in 24. Rubio's up, became Secretary of State. So this race in 2026 is actually a race going to be run by Ashley Moody, who right now is serving as the incumbent senator from the state of Florida. Looking at the race itself, it's going to be quite interesting. Looking at, what we will expect. Maybe the race will be competitive. Maybe there will be a competitive GOP primary, regardless of how you cut the Republicans, because there are quite a few candidates who do want to run against the incumbent appointed senator here. No guarantee that they win the nomination, but certainly a near guarantee that they win the eventual election. My bet right now is that Republicans are in a pretty strong position in the state. That puts the GOP at one more seat closer to the majority. The next state I'd characterize as likely this time for the Democrats is the state of New Mexico. I think we're going to see a margin here of roughly 12, 13 points. It's just on the lower end of the safe category, so it's not actually considered safe, on the higher end, rather, of the likely category. So we're hovering around there where if the circumstances are right, Democrats might be able to really demolish Republicans in the state. If not, it's going to be a little bit closer. Either way, though, double-digit victory for Democrats. National environment really lends itself to New Mexico, already a state that Clinton won, Harris won, Biden won by double digits. Looking at 2026, could see very similar things happen in this cycle. New Jersey as well, I'd say pretty easily is a likely Democratic state. It really doesn't need to be. We're probably going to see Cory Booker win this race. 12, 13 points as well. It has in recent memory gotten a little bit closer, but in a national environment like 2026, just as 2018 showed us, New Jersey can become quite the Democratic state. And so for now, Booker has the upper hand for sure. I think that'll maintain itself through the election. His margin of victory is yet to be seen, but gives Democrats another seat, putting them up at 43. Now, the Republicans also have the state of Nebraska. This is a state that there is an independent, not really a Democrat, in the state that is competing against the Republicans, who does have a very realistic shot at winning the Senate race there. But by realistic, I say more realistic rather than a Democrat in the state, meaning a Democrat who might have less than a 1% chance of winning. Dan Osborne, the independent here, maybe has a 10, 15% chance of winning. And even then, it's hard to see. 2026 could be the year that if it was done right, it would be able to happen. In 2024, Dan Osborne made a name for himself by coming within 6 points of the Nebraska Senate race, but I'm not sure we're going to see it against a former popular governor, now Senator Pete Ricketts, in the state of Nebraska. But I do think it will be narrower because Dan Osborne has that name ID, is not associated with the National Democratic Party, and will run a very similar playbook against the GOP. The question is, does it work this time? My bet is no, but that is yet to be seen, putting the Republicans at 47. The Democrats also have a likely seat out of the state of New Hampshire, which could border being a safe seat for the Democrats. I think we're more likely to keeping it in this likely column, but for now, Democrats can rely on this seat. There's a retiring incumbent here, Jean Shaheen, who had won multitudes of elections before, not just for Senate, but other races across the state, did quite well in 2021 by about 15. Chris Pappas, U.S. representative from one of the districts in New Hampshire, is running frontrunner on the Democratic side. He'll likely be the next senator from New Hampshire, bumping the Democrats up to 44. Now, Republicans also have their own states, as I've been talking about. Alaska and Texas, I think, join in as the next two states that we can consider to be likely. You might be surprised to see both of these states as likely for the Republicans. Many people, especially on the right, would like to argue these states are safe, maybe in terms of predictive chance, but in terms of actual margin here, I fully expect that if Ken Paxton wins the nomination, he wins the Senate race narrowly. But I do think that there are vulnerabilities there. Paxton could see a much closer race than John Cornyn as of now. I'd err on the side of caution for Democrats because not every Democrat is announced. The Republican primary is a long time away from actually being fully underway. So Texas right now, I'd say, is likely for the GOP. Alaska is likely, even with Mary Peltola in the race. I could see it becoming lean at initial indication. I'd say that Alaska still remains a likely state. It's going to be one that will be hotly contested. Democrats will invest a lot of money in it if Mary Peltola enters into the race, but she already starts out at about a 5-point disadvantage, and given that the severity and the stakes of a Senate election are tremendously higher than a House election, I think voters will vote accordingly. But I could also see a circumstance where she does narrow it up, and it could be 4 or 5 points. I don't think that she starts out as the favorite, and I think that even with her name in the ring, Alaska is still a likely red state. The remaining 7 toss-up races here, again, don't exactly all have toss-ups either. Democrats are the likely victors in the state of Virginia. That bumps them up to 45. The final few states here are really ones that have seen a lot of conversation and a lot of focus as of late. Joni Ernst announced that she's not running for re-election in the state of Iowa. I tend to believe that unless an extreme MAGA candidate gets through the Iowa Senate race that looks even more extreme than Donald Trump or other Republicans that have been able to win across the state, that this is actually a narrow net positive for Joni Ernst, who probably knew that if it was any Republican who could lose the Senate race in Iowa, it was going to be her. In Ohio, Sherrod Brown has entered into the race. Michigan still doesn't have a clear front runner. Roy Cooper's numbers look better in North Carolina. Georgia hasn't seen much movement, and Graham Plattner in the state of Maine is running on a very populist message here. and a very anti-establishment message that could be quite interesting to see how it really develops. As of now, I think that we start out with Republicans maintaining control of the United States Senate. I think Iowa starts out as a likely red state here, but I think that's where we end on the likely red states. 3 months ago, it would have included Ohio and Maine, and neither of those two states today, I think, could share the characterization of likely. But the unfortunate reality for Democrats is that with a Vice President J.D. Vance, even if Democrats win all of the remaining races here, which 3 of them right now are held by Republican incumbents, if they even were to win them, the Republicans would still maintain Senate control. And that's because this map is so lopsided in favor of the GOP. You see, with Iowa going towards the Republicans in this prediction, the narrowest state that Republicans would need to win is a Trump plus 13 state, and that is Iowa. Florida is to the right of Iowa. Texas is to the right of Iowa. Nebraska and Alaska are to the right of Iowa. This state puts the Republicans at 50 across the map, meaning the remaining 5, even if Democrats win them all, which I'm going to tell you now they are not going to win them all, at least not as of right now. Even if that happens, Democrats still come up short of the Senate majority, which is why this map, again, is all about gaming for the future of 2028 and 2030 rather than just 2026. Obviously, a lot to focus on now, but as it stands, the pathway to the Senate majority for Democrats is quite slim. Not impossible, but quite slim. 5 remaining toss-up races here. What do we notice? Well, I'd say the Democrats actually do have pretty good positions in some of these states. I think in a state like Georgia, they start off with an advantage with Jon Ossoff. No Republican seems to have been able to take that on. The Republicans here in this race are lackluster at best, and I think that the GOP could have had a better slate of candidates, but they simply don't. And the candidate Mike Collins, who I think right now is the front runner in the state of Georgia, I think is a bit too far to the right to actually do quite well in this state. Even though he is, trying to be Donald Trump, there is a level of excusal that a lot of the American public and voters do give to Donald Trump they will not give to somebody like Mike Collins. And it's the same thing that we saw with Herschel Walker and Carrie Lake and candidates like them across this country that tried to embody Donald Trump's essence, but voters just simply don't like that. Jon Ossoff, I think, on track for re-election there. The next state, too, is Michigan. I'd say this is another state the Democrats have had a shockingly, not shockingly, but surprisingly closer race. It should not be this close. Michigan should be a state that, having voted for Trump by 2 points, should shift back in the next election, but Democrats are not on the verge of a solid victory. I think this race is closer to 1 or 2 points than it is to 4 or 5 points, and that's a problem for the Democratic Party. They win the Senate race, sure, doesn't matter. But a lot of this depends on whether or not this Democratic primary ends up being cleaner, ends up being one that, there is more of a coalition candidate and someone who can actually break through the primary process, but also to the general. We will see. Right now, Michigan stands to be a lean Democratic state here. 3 remaining toss-up races, but Michigan, again, I think in some cases might actually vote to the right of a state like Georgia in 2026, which is baffling, but also not too far out of left field given the 2024 election results. So 3 remaining races here, I'd say that the Republicans still hold the upper hand in Ohio with Sherrod Brown in the race. It's narrower than before. It's been likely for quite some time now. I think that the Republicans are going to find that Sherrod Brown will give them a run for his money. But John Huston is by no means this unelectable trash Republican candidate, right? We've seen before that there are candidates that, and I don't use the term trash lightly, but I do think there are certainly candidates that I think you could have found somebody better by far and by a mile, just by searching a mile further in a congressional district or in a Senate race here. In Ohio, though, Huston, I think, is as best the Republican Party is going to get for an appointee that's non-problematic, doesn't have scandals, doesn't have a track record that can be weaponized and used against him. Sherrod Brown, obviously, one of the best Democrats that could run in this race, but at the end of the day, Sherrod Brown came up short in 2024 against an extremely lackluster Republican, against a better Republican, but a better national environment for Democrats. I think Sherrod Brown, still right now, would lose this Senate race by 2 to 3 points. It would be narrower, I think, than 2024. But ultimately the same outcome. Sherrod Brown loses the Senate race, and John Huston is elected to a full term in the United States Senate. So that brings the Republicans to 51. Okay, what about the Democrats? Well, I think they still hold on to North Carolina. This is a race I've been pretty adamant about since Roy Cooper got into it. Someone who has never lost a Senate race, a race in North Carolina in his lifetime. North Carolina right now, I think that Roy Cooper starts out with a pretty tremendous advantage. Michael Whatley isn't selling me on how electable he is. I think that he is a candidate who has cleared the field, but to the degree that I think that really helps him in a general? Not as much, and I don't imagine that he's going to be able to really fight back against Roy Cooper. North Carolina has been very tricky for Democrats. If there's one person who I do believe adamantly can do it, I do think it is Roy Cooper, and I do think that he wins a Senate term in North Carolina in the 2026 cycle. The last state, and I think one that has been uniquely difficult for Democrats to find a coalition candidate in the race because they're waiting on the governor and they're waiting on the attorney general and all of these people who float the idea of wanting to run for Senate in 2026, that one remaining race in the state of Maine, right now, I think Susan Collins still holds a narrow advantage. Yes, Graham Plattner provides something new and invigorating into the race, but I have yet to see anything besides a Graham Plattner internal that he would win against Susan Collins. Do I think it's possible? Yes. That's why I have this state as the closest of every state that I've characterized thus far. But do I think Susan Collins is the favorite right now? The answer is also yes. This race has become, again, very difficult for Democrats because it's not as if their bench is weak. There are strong candidates. They just simply did not want to run for Senate. And so now, you have Graham Plattner, who is not an establishment name, but someone who seems to be really exciting and invigorating the Democratic base in the state of Maine and providing, an answer to this call of who will run against Susan Collins and who has a chance of beating her. Well, I do think that Plattner has a chance, but I think Collins is still the favorite today. I need to see more data. Maine is actually one of the states that has the least amount of polling data out of the state, besides internals on both sides, and there isn't really much out of it. If this was 6 years ago, we probably would have had much more data, but I think a lot more polling firms are either, one, entirely confidential, and the data is only released to the candidates and does not get released publicly, especially if the data doesn't look good in either direction. But also, too, what you will find is that a lot of the times these polling firms that might felt that they were wrong in 2024 or that no one trusts or wants to invest in polling anymore might not feel the need and urgency behind polling Maine for 2026. And so it is interesting. I think Susan Collins right now, again, maintains that upper hand. She still is an electoral juggernaut no matter how you cut it. I do think she's vulnerable, and I do think that she could very well lose in 2026. But you shouldn't write her off. This race is going to be competitive with a strong Democrat or without one, and I think it will be a race to watch. In fact, I think it will be the race to watch in the 2026 midterm cycle. Democrats at 48, flipping the state of North Carolina. Republicans at 52, holding on to Ohio, Alaska, and Maine, prime targets right now for the Democratic Party, and it will be interesting to see. There are opportunities the Democrats might have at flipping a state like Maine and potentially flipping a state like Ohio, but their options are limited, and this Senate map doesn't make it easy. Republicans at 52, Democrats at 48. This is the state of the race today. In my prediction, Republicans again lose one seat, but ultimately maintain Senate control. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.